It's no secret by now that there has been a memorandum of understanding, that is the latest peace deal of President Trump brokering this deal with Iran to begin a ceasefire. And there are all kinds of eyebrows being raised, both sides of the aisle, all around the world. Not the least of which might be the fact that, at least at the time of this production, Israel is not a signatory on this deal either. So neither are the countries that are being talked about to help finance the rebuilding. We're going to get into a lot of that, but I wanted to set up that scene that this really looks fairly unilateral between Trump and his office and Iran and their regime. Are we glad that we're not bombing each other? Yes, but is this really the win that, well, we would hope it would be? Well, let's talk about this developing agreement between the United States and Iran. And I need to make this disclaimer because this is still unfolding. Now, I don't want to issue a final verdict today, because we need to see how things will play out. We need to see, for example, the signed agreement. We need to see the completed terms. We need to see how the conditions are defined. We need to see how compliance is verified. And I would say, most importantly, what actually happens after everybody leaves the signing table. When the ceremony is done and the cameras go home, what happens? Our early optics are not the final results, but the early optics still matter. And the early optics here raise one enormous question. What exactly did the United States win? We asked, are we better off? Because when you look at the reported framework, it certainly appears that America is giving up a great deal in exchange for Iran restoring conditions that largely existed before this war began. The United States would reportedly, begin lifting its naval blockade. We would eventually withdraw our forces from around Iran. Certain sanctions on Iranian oil would be waived. Frozen Iranian assets could be released. A final agreement then could establish a timetable for eliminating broader American and United Nations sanctions. We're hearing 60 days for that. Iran, meanwhile, would reopen the Strait of Hormuz and pledge, yet again, not to produce a nuclear weapon. And we know how their word is their bond. Now, perhaps the final agreement will contain much stronger provisions, or perhaps there are verification mechanisms that have not yet been made public. Maybe there are enforcement measures that are strong enough to change the entire calculation. But based on what has been reported so far, America seems to be offering very tangible concessions immediately, or at least on a defined timetable, while several of Iran's most important concessions remain subjects for future negotiations. That's as best as I can tell. Now, this is not a small distinction, okay? We stop imposing new sanctions. We waive certain existing sanctions. We unblock Iranian oil exports. We discuss releasing frozen money. We lift the blockade. We plan our withdrawal. And Iran promises to discuss what it might eventually do about enrichment, nuclear stockpiles, and other unresolved questions. Now, that sounds less like surrender and more like a group project where America does the first 11 pages, and then Iran promises to look over the conclusion at some time in the near future. It's very reassuring. Vice President J.D. Vance says the benefits are conditions-based. The administration says Iran will not receive the full economic package, and we're talking $300 billion, unless it transforms its conduct, dismantles its nuclear ambitions, and complies with the eventual agreement. Okay, fine. But what are the conditions? Who determines whether they have been met? I mean, beyond just don't make a nuclear weapon, what are the specifics? How long must Iran comply? What happens when Iran provides partial access, or when they contest an inspection, or dispute the meaning of a provision, or what happens if Iran claims the United States violated the agreement first? We've seen this before. The regime makes a promise. Western diplomats applaud the promise. Inspectors encounter resistance. Iran demands more concessions. Everybody spends 6 months debating whether the violation technically qualifies as a violation. And somewhere in Washington, somebody explains that giving Tehran another economic benefit is necessary to preserve the agreement that Tehran is currently violating. I mean, am I missing something here? The framework also reportedly contemplates a reconstruction and development program that is worth at least $300 billion, as I mentioned before. The administration says American taxpayers will not fund it. Reuters reports that it is intended to be a private investment fund with money coming from companies and investors in the United States, the Gulf states, and other regions. So here we have another public-private partnership, except this time it's global. That's going to go really well. And I'm sure that taxpayers, we're not a dime of our money is going to go for that, right? Does anybody believe that? We are also being told that more than half of the proposed amount may have already been committed privately. And maybe that's exactly how it will work. But the draft language reportedly describes the United States and its regional partners as committing to create the program, as in it doesn't exist currently. The governing mechanism is still being negotiated. The financing is still being explained. The final obligations are still unclear. So please forgive those of us Americans for wanting to see the paperwork before we accept the words "no taxpayer money" as the end of the discussion. We've heard all this before. It always starts as private investment. It moves on to government guarantees. And then we have loan protections and then tax incentives. And then Congress is told that the entire peace process will collapse unless American taxpayers provide emergency stabilization funding. And suddenly, the program that didn't cost us anything requires yet another must-pass spending package at 2 o'clock in the morning. Americans have already paid for the military operation. Americans have absorbed and are currently absorbing the economic disruption. American service members were placed in danger. Some, at least 13, maybe 14, lost their lives, and that's not counting the civilians that were killed in the war. American resources were deployed throughout the region, and now America is helping to arrange the reconstruction. So we paid for the war, and we may wind up underwriting, guaranteeing, and politically supporting the cleanup. And as I asked on a previous program, what did we win? Did we win this? We're told Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. That's good. Iran should never possess a nuclear weapon. Their regime is brutal. They're authoritarian. They're anti-American. They're openly hostile to the entire world, and certainly the West. There should be no confusion about what kind of government we are dealing with. This is not an argument that Iran is wonderful, right? Their regime is evil. But the question is whether this war accomplished what its defenders claimed it would accomplish. Before the attack began on February 28th, the stated objective was preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Iran didn't have a nuclear weapon at that time. And we were told we obliterated them, their capabilities. And then after months of bombing, blockades, casualties, economic disruption, and escalating threats, Iran still doesn't have the nuclear weapon. But neither, according to, the publicly reported framework, has Iran necessarily surrendered its entire nuclear infrastructure. Neither have they permanently ended their enrichment. Neither have they immediately transferred all the enriched material out of its control. So those questions appear to be heading into another round of negotiations. So what was all the rest of this for? Was it to reopen the Strait of Hormuz? The strait was open before the war. Iran closed it and restricted it after the United States and Israel attacked Iran. Now Iran would reopen it as a part of a deal in which America lifts the blockade, relaxes sanctions, and eventually leaves the region. We broke the window, paid to secure the building. negotiated with the man holding the hammer, and now we're celebrating because he has agreed to stop breaking glass, provided we help finance the remodeling. Are we following this so far? And even after this agreement, Iran would remain geographically positioned along the Strait of Hormuz. Iran would still possess the capacity to threaten shipping. Iran would still exercise enormous influence over the waterway. The reported agreement restores commercial passage. It does not relocate Iran. So again, what did we win? Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, at least not yet. But if Tehran eventually gains access to hundreds of billions of dollars in new investment, in sanctions relief, in oil revenue, and previously frozen assets, I would think we had better be absolutely certain that the verification provisions are real, because money is fungible. Iran's leaders don't have to take a check marked, "This is for our nuclear weapons program," and deposit it directly into a centrifuge. Investment can rebuild ports, roads and energy systems, manufacturing capacity, and transportation networks. And this frees the regime to direct its existing resources toward the military, the Revolutionary Guard, missile development, proxy organizations, and whatever nuclear capabilities survive the war. The Iranian government will advertise reconstruction as a humanitarian relief for the Iranian people, but authoritarian regimes have never had difficulty placing themselves at the front of the line. They will rebuild the infrastructure that preserves their power. They will reward the institutions that protect the regime. They will produce the photographs and headlines necessary to reassure foreign investors. And ordinary Iranians will receive whatever's left over after the ruling class has taken its portion. The administration understands that Americans are asking these questions. And that's why officials are already emphasizing that the benefits are conditional, that taxpayers won't pay for the fund, that military action could resume if Iran violates the agreement. And these assurances may prove true. But they are also an acknowledgement that the White House knows how this agreement looks. It looks as though the United States escalated into war, inflicted massive damage, spent untold resources, and is now negotiating its way back toward the pre-war status quo, except Iran may emerge with sanctions relief, restored oil revenue, released assets, and access to a reconstruction program valued at $300 billion. Maybe the final terms will change that assessment. Maybe Iran's nuclear infrastructure has been damaged beyond repair. Maybe inspections will be truly intrusive. Maybe enrichment will end. Maybe the stockpile will be removed or diluted under meaningful international supervision. Maybe the financing will remain entirely private with no American guarantees and no future taxpayer bailout. I really hope so. But that's not a strategy. And a press conference is not a victory. Jesus said, Luke 14, that a king considering war must first sit down and determine whether he is able to meet the opposing force. In the same passage, he spoke of a man calculating whether he possessed enough resources to complete what he began. The principle is simple: count the cost before you begin. I'm not sure we did. That doesn't mean that a nation must never fight. Scripture clearly recognizes that government's responsibility to restrain evil, to protect the innocent, but moral authority does not excuse strategic recklessness or strategic presumption. Before sending Americans into danger, leaders should know the objective. Before winning a war, they should know what victory means. And before spending blood and treasure, they should know what conditions will justify stopping. Before promising reconstruction, sanctions relief, and economic reintegration, our leaders should be able to explain in plain English what America received in return. Again, maybe this agreement will produce lasting peace. Maybe it will permanently prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Maybe history will judge this operation more favorably than the early documents suggest. But right now, Americans are absolutely entitled to ask a question that should have been answered before the first missile was launched. What was the mission? Was it regime change? Apparently not. Was it the destructions of Iran's nuclear program? That remains uncertain. Was it permanent control of the Strait of Hormuz? Iran still controls it. Was it unconditional surrender? Well, this is a conditions-based agreement negotiated between two governments. That's not a surrender. Was it merely a promise that Iran will not build a nuclear weapon? Because we had that before. And if we fought a war, spent the money, absorbed the risk, disrupted the world's energy markets, and now help rebuild Iran only to arrive at another promise, then I don't think we traveled in a circle. I think we paid for the privilege of ending where we started. The final verdict must wait for the final results. But while we wait, the burden is not on the American people to prove this agreement is a failure. The burden is on the people who launched the operation to show us what victory looks like, not in slogans or headlines, not in social media posts and tweets, in measurable, verifiable, and lasting results. Because a nation that refuses to count the cost before war will eventually discover that the bill always arrives afterward, and somehow it always has the American taxpayer's name on it.